I'm going to speak to you this evening about British coronations, and I'm sure many of you saw the recent coronation of King Charles III. This is a photo from that coronation. I think they overdid it on the gold, but it gives you a very good idea of one part of the ceremony. This is the end of the investiture and the actual coronation part. One question that has occurred to me about the coronation, it occurred to me when I was watching it, was what purpose does a coronation serve? What is it actually all about? What is the... Oh, okay. I'll stay a little closer to it. What is the point of a coronation? And it turns out that the answer to that question is a little bit complicated. It's also a question that you wouldn't want to ask the people involved in a coronation, because you would probably be given an answer that wouldn't be entirely satisfactory. They might tell you that a coronation is traditional, that it goes back hundreds of years. And in some respects that's true, but many aspects of the coronation as you now see it have changed over time. And in fact, there's very little in the current coronation that would be familiar to Anglo-Saxon kings, except the sequence. The sequence would be familiar to them. So it's not so much that it's simply traditional. It does, in fact, fulfill a purpose. And I want to explore in the next 45 minutes or so what that purpose may be. So let me start with what the coronation does not do. It does not make a king, all right? The king or queen succeeds prior to the coronation and is already the king or queen and enjoys full powers before the coronation. So in the case of Charles III, his accession to the throne followed, well, theoretically followed immediately after the death of his predecessor. And I say theoretically because there is an intermediate stage. It's not a stage that is shared with the public, and it's not much talked about. But since the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne in 1603, an accession council consisting of the Privy Council plus some additional officers, depending on how the council is set up, will meet at St. James's Palace, which is a not particularly lovely looking palace in central London, where they will determine who the next heir is. Normally, that determination has already been done for them. There already is a Prince of Wales or an heir in the waiting, and all they do is recognize that heir. But in the case of James VI, his predecessor, Queen Elizabeth I, did not designate an heir. She didn't designate an heir on her deathbed either, although her chief counselor, Robert Cecil, claimed that she did. In fact, she did not. She died without designating anyone as her heir. And so, in 1603, Cecil had to summon an accession council at St. James, and that became a tradition, followed ever since. So the first thing to know about coronations is that they don't create a king, they don't make a king, they don't give any further powers to a king. Incidentally, the king you see over at the left is Athelstan. This is, in fact, the first actual portrait of an English king that doesn't appear on a coin. It appears in a manuscript, and Athelstan was the first Anglo-Saxon king to be crowned. His coronation fulfilled a number of different purposes, among them a claim to rule Scotland, and Scotland already had a coronation prior to England, and so by crowning himself, he was laying claim to being king of all of Britain, and that was a title that he took for himself after his coronation. But kings since then have not, in fact, used the coronation as a way of pursuing some rivalry with a neighboring kingdom. It's fulfilled different purposes since Athelstan, and it's those purposes that I want to look at today. Point number 2 to remember about the coronation is that the crown of England, and later the crown, after 1603, the crown of the United Kingdom of England and Scotland, did not have a clear law of succession until very, very recently. And by that I mean there is no Salic law in England. And by the Salic law I mean the actual law by which the succession to the French throne was determined. There is no set procedure, as there was in the old Holy Roman Empire, to determine who the next heir is going to be. In the Holy Roman Empire, they determined it by election. There's no election in English monarchy. So how do you determine who the next heir is going to be? Well, before 2013, the succession was usually, although not always, in the direct male line of succession. There are 2 major breaks in modern times with that rule. The first was made by Henry VIII, who, according to his will, which was read in 1547, his son, Edward VI, would succeed him, but in the event of Edward's death, Henry designated his 2 daughters, Mary, whom you see over there on the left, and Elizabeth on the right, as his heirs. This was the first time that the direct female succession had been named by a king as heirs to the throne. And ever since then, a woman can succeed to the throne as long as there is no direct male heir. And by a direct male heir, I mean a son or a grandchild of the previous male heir. So Henry VIII complicated everything. The second act that complicated everything was the Revolution of 1688, which deposed a Catholic king, James II, and installed a Protestant pair of monarchs, William and Mary. In 1689, Parliament passed an act, what was known as the Bill of Rights, stating that no Catholic, nor in fact anyone married to a Catholic, could become King of England or Queen of England. And from that day until this, that rule has stood, although in 2013, it was changed somewhat. In 2013, Parliament passed the first actual act determining who would succeed to the British throne. So Charles III is the first King of England to succeed under this new legislation. What that legislation did was, first, it abolished primogeniture. It said that the previous monarch's eldest son would not automatically succeed to the throne. He or she could be succeeded by an eldest daughter. In other words, it introduced women into the direct line of succession by law, which had never been done before. And secondly, it eliminated the provisions of both the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement, stating that the monarch could not be married to a Catholic. It did not, however, remove the stipulation that the throne could not go to a Catholic. So while Charles III could be married to a Catholic, he cannot be a Catholic himself. All right? And it thereby preserved one of the most significant and, in some minds, the most obnoxious rules for the succession to the throne. So since 2013, there has actually been a law determining who the successor is. And that is going to determine who Charles III's successor is. Now, in Charles's case, it's pretty clear he's likely to be succeeded by his son William. He doesn't have any daughters, and William is the next in line. But he now has a law to back up this tradition, if you want. And yet, he was crowned. So clearly the crowning of Charles III doesn't have anything to do with determining the succession. That has been done by law. A third point about coronations is that they usually follow within a year after the accession. But there are exceptions. King Edward I was crowned 2 years after coming to the throne because he happened to be out on crusade when his father, Henry III, died. Now, he could have come back right away from the crusade, but he took his time. He took 2 years before he got back to England. And that was because he wanted to settle things in France before he returned to England. He still had possessions in France, and he wanted to make sure that they were going to recognize him as their ruler before he returned and was crowned. And that really illustrates to you that coronation was certainly not viewed in Edward I's time as necessary. It was a desirable thing to do, but it was not a necessary thing to do. Edward put it off for 2 years before actually getting around to doing it. The other case of a long wait between coming to the throne and being crowned is that of Henry VI. Now, Henry VI's father, Henry V, had fought a very successful campaign in France in 1415, and he claimed to be King of France as well as King of England. So his son, Henry VI, was eventually crowned as both King of England and in a separate ceremony as King of France. And the picture that's to the right here shows him being crowned as King of France, not as King of England. There is no actual picture of Henry VI being crowned as King of England. But he waited 7 years because he was a child when he came to the throne, and at the time it was not thought proper for a child to go through the coronation ceremony. So he waited 7 years before being crowned. Now, what these cases illustrate for us really is that the rules of when you get crowned are not fixed. They're really up to the monarch himself. He can decide to be crowned a year into his reign, as most of them have, or he can wait longer if he wishes. It's entirely up to the monarch to determine when he's going to be crowned. Since 1066, however, with one exception, all of them have been crowned at Westminster Abbey. And Westminster Abbey is the very big, imposing building that sits sort of across the street from the Houses of Parliament. So it's very close to the Houses of Parliament, and more important, in the early days, it was close to Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall used to be where the high law courts met. The law courts that met in London met in Westminster Hall. You can still see Westminster Hall as you walk into Parliament. It's off to your left. It's a great big open chamber dating from the Middle Ages. And interestingly enough, Westminster Hall is not in as bad condition as the rest of the Houses of Parliament. The Houses of Parliament, as some of you may know, are in absolutely dire condition and are going to have to probably be closed for several years in order to repair the roofing and many other aspects of the buildings. Yet they were only constructed in the 1830s. Westminster Hall is in much better shape, and it dates back many hundreds of years before that to, I think, the 1200s. In any case, Westminster Abbey is where the coronation takes place. The exception to that rule was Henry III, the father of King Edward I. Henry III was first crowned in 1216 at St. Peter's Church in Gloucester, which is today Gloucester Cathedral. He was crowned a second time 4 years later at Westminster Abbey. And again, what this illustrates to you is there are no rules on this. Each monarch makes up their own rules as they go along, and he decided it's okay to be crowned twice. once in Gloucester and once in Westminster. But he also had a second reason for wanting to be crowned at Westminster, because he was determined to rebuild the Abbey. And it was Henry III really who rebuilt Westminster Abbey during his long reign. He reigned for about 40 or 50 years. And one of the things that he built at Westminster Abbey was this floor, the Cosmati pavement. And the Cosmati pavement is a mosaic pavement that was laid by Italian artisans. That's where you got pavement layers in the 1200s. And it's still there, and it's still in extremely good condition. And that is where coronations continue to take place today. So you may have noticed the Cosmati pavement. Most of it was covered over with that rather gaudy gold carpet that they used, but you may have caught glimpses of the Cosmati pavement. And since his reign, it's been used for coronations. Coronations follow a script, and the script is general. It's not very specific, but it does have very specific phases to it. And that script is written down, and the written script for all coronations has been the same since really the 1400s. And the written script is not for the coronation of a king, it's for the coronation of a queen. Because in the early days, queens were crowned, that is to say, queen consorts, who were not ruling queens, but who were married to the king. Queens were crowned, and very often the Prince of Wales also was crowned. They did not bring back the coronation of the consort under Elizabeth II. Her husband, Prince Philip, was never crowned, somewhat to his annoyance. But they did bring back a kind of coronation ceremony for Charles when he became Prince of Wales. It wasn't a ceremony similar to the medieval ceremony of crowning an heir to the throne, but it had certain parallels. It was carried out not by a bunch of bishops, but by his mother, who actually invested him, and it was called an investiture. It took place in 1969 in Wales. But that was a made-up ceremony. That was just something they invented for Charles. The coronation ceremony of kings, the crowning of kings, follows the Liber Regalis. And the Liber Regalis is a book describing the coronation not of a king, but of a queen. And that queen was Anne of Bohemia. Anne of Bohemia was the queen to King Richard II. She was crowned in 1382. And ever since then, well, not quite ever since then, for the first 100 years, they were using different ordos or ceremonies for the coronation. But from the late 1400s, her coronation ceremony becomes the standard one for kings being crowned. Now, this is the cover of the Liber Regalis. It may show Richard II and Anne of Bohemia. We're not sure if these are meant to be portraits. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But in any case, it shows her being crowned, and he's already got his crown, and he's sitting on his throne. So it's clear that it's for the coronation of a queen. But it would determine the stages of the coronation right down until today. Now, what's interesting is that at first it was claimed that the Liber Regalis followed very strictly the coronation ceremony of Anglo-Saxon kings. That is less certain now. We're not so certain how Anglo-Saxon kings were crowned. But in any case, it's old enough to claim some precedence among ceremonial ordos or recensions, as they're called. So the Liber Regalis has remained the order, or has remained the basis for determining the order of the ceremony down until today. And what are the stages of that ceremony? Well, they are pretty simple. First, the entry procession, that is to say, the king coming into Westminster Abbey. Secondly, the acclamation and the oath. The king is acclaimed, not by everybody. In the early days, he was not acclaimed by everybody. And an oath is taken. He takes an oath, rather. Third, the anointing, and that is done today privately. It's not done in public. And some of you may have noticed this. It was very oddly staged. It has been oddly staged for the last 150 years, and it was quite oddly staged at Charles III's coronation, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Fourthly, the investiture. The investiture is just when the king is given the various regalia that designates him as the king. Fifth, the crowning. Sixth, the enthronement, where he is seated in his throne and again receives homage from those in attendance. And finally, the closing procession. However, kings have altered details of the ceremony as they have seen fit. In fact, over time, they've altered just about every detail of this ceremony. What they've maintained is the order, all right, the basis of the ordo or recension. What they've altered is all the details. And the details really do amount to something. The trick is in the details. Before 1685, for example, kings processed in the entry procession from the Tower of London. Now, the Tower of London is several miles away from Westminster Abbey. It's about, I think, 2.5, 3 miles away. So this was a long procession. And the king had to walk it, attended by a large number of people marching in file. And by the time Charles II got to Westminster Abbey, and he rode part of the way, he was pretty tired. And he was tired from saluting people to right and left for 2.5, 3 miles. So his successor, James II, changed the ceremony. And ever since 1685, kings have not processed from Westminster Abbey. They have processed only from Westminster Hall, which is, as I mentioned to you, where the law courts used to meet. It's a building that is attached to the current Houses of Parliament. It's not a very long procession. In recent coronations, the monarch has processed from Buckingham Palace down to Westminster Abbey and back again. But they didn't buy Buckingham Palace until the late 18th century, and it was only in the early 19th century that Buckingham Palace became the beginning of the procession. One thing you can see from this depiction of James II's procession is it was very long. It was a long procession of people. And the king is, the king is down here and under the canopy, attended by various attendants. But the procession started long before the canopy appeared. That is no longer done. They don't process on foot. They process in a carriage. And the procession is nowhere near as long nowadays as it was in the 17th century. And that procession, really the size of it has gone back and forth. George I and George II, George III had relatively abbreviated processions. And in fact, the coronations of the first 3 Georges are not much remembered because there was nothing particularly special about them. But George IV determined that he would have a really big coronation procession. And not only would he have a big coronation procession, he was going to do it under a canopy that was built all along the procession way into Westminster Abbey. And you can see here a print of his coronation in July 1821, crowds of people standing pretty close to the canopy, but all under it, except the people up in the box over there. And they would have paid for the privilege of looking down on the procession. And it was a very long procession. In fact, this was the most expensive coronation in history, and it has never been reproduced. No monarch since then has wanted to reproduce it because it was one among many factors that made George IV extremely unpopular with his subjects. And no monarch has wanted to imitate that. It was also a blatant attempt at publicity. He knew he was unpopular before he ascended to the throne, and he wanted to raise his image by a really all-out coronations, a big festival in which the whole population could participate. What he didn't reckon on was that what people would mostly remember from his coronation was the cost of it, how expensive it was. And as I mentioned, it's never been repeated since then. So he gets, the king gets to the abbey, and the first stage of the ceremony is the acclamation or oath. The recognition or acclamation initially represented acceptance of the new monarch by the people. But the people didn't mean everybody. What it meant was the few nobles and high members of the clergy who were actually in attendance. The people in early coronations were kept outside the abbey. All right, they weren't allowed in. From 1661, the coronation of Charles II, the public is allowed into the abbey, but only a very select few. And the people who do the recognition or acclaiming are actually only the ones who are up on the stage. First, the members of the royal family. You may have noticed that at Charles III's coronation, they were parked very close to where the action was going on. And that was in part because they're expected to lead in the acclamation. Then the nobility, and then finally the clergy. That wasn't good enough for the Archbishop of Canterbury, the current Archbishop of Canterbury. He decided he wanted to add an element of popular participation by reading out an oath that was to be repeated by people at home watching it on television. It was a nice idea. It did not work out very well. Nobody knows how many people actually recited the oath, how many of them were actually following what they were supposed to do, but no doubt it was a mere fraction of the people who were watching the ceremony take place. So I'm not sure they're going to repeat that one at the next coronation. But in any case, it did represent a somewhat valiant attempt to move the acclamation beyond the people up on stage. I should note that today, the people up on stage are not only the nobility and the clergy. They also include representatives of both the House of Commons and of the City of London. So there are people on stage for the ceremony who are, if you want, ordinary people. And moreover, the acclamation is, for the last couple of hundred years, is supposed to be echoed by the whole crowd. So it's no longer done simply by the nobility and the clergy, although the nobility and the clergy maintain a very large role in this part of the ceremony. Then comes the oath, and the oath has changed a lot over time. I'm not going to go into all the changes. James II changed it because he was a Roman Catholic. William and Mary changed it. After 1689, when William and Mary were crowned, the monarch has promised to govern according to the laws of Parliament, and to uphold the Church of England, which their predecessor, James II, was not perceived as doing. Charles III added a preamble to the oath in the current, or in the most recent coronation ceremony. A preamble in which he promised to uphold all faiths, not just the Church of England, and to govern according to the laws and customs of his kingdoms, which was a kind of gesture towards the fact that the United Kingdom does not simply consist of England, it also consists of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and the Church of England is not established in any of those three places. Charles also accepted the Accession Declaration Act of 1910. Now that act declared that the monarch was a practicing Protestant, and he swore to it or accepted it in the course of his oath. So the oath has changed a good deal over time, and it's actually a good reflection of the changing politics of the monarchy since the 17th century. The next stage is what many people find to be the strange one, the weird one, the anointing ceremony. Now, Charles's anointing was done behind a screen, this very ornate screen that you see in front of you. And you can see that the military officers around the screen are holding their heads down in deference. Not everybody has picked up on that. Charles is about to go behind the screen where he will be blessed with consecrated oil on his head, his hands, and his heart. It is not thought that this should be seen by the public. Now, in the early days, it was seen by the public, but the public only included the nobility and the clergy. Ever since they have made the ceremony more public, it's been done in private. His mother did it behind a screen in Westminster Abbey. Charles did it behind a screen. What was the purpose of this part of the ceremony? Well, it was to make the king's body sacred, like that of a bishop. And in fact, bishops were consecrated in much the same way, with holy oil. Today, that meaning has more or less disappeared. The king is not regarded as equivalent to a bishop. He is the head of the Church of England, but he can't lead a religious ceremony, for example. And he doesn't have the powers of a bishop within the church. But it's supposed to have been quite meaningful for his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. She is believed to have derived from the anointing a sense of her own divinely appointed destiny, that no one but God had put her here, and God wanted her to stay there. And this is why she never, ever even considered abdication, no matter how old she got or how old her son got. She felt this was a lifelong job. It's very difficult to sort out whether she really did think this and whether she thought it from the time of her anointing onwards, or whether this was invented by various royal biographers. I don't really know. But whatever the case, she does seem to have felt that God had given her a particular duty, and she stuck to that duty for the next 70 years. During the anointing ceremony, the monarch sits on this chair, and as you'll notice, this chair, the coronation chair, is covered with graffiti. Graffiti that was carved onto it in the 17th and 18th centuries when the chair was just sitting out at Westminster Abbey, and anybody who could reach it, who could get there with a knife, could carve their initials into the chair, could carve, any message that they wanted into the chair, and so it is littered with graffiti. But it's still maintained as the coronation chair. Why? Well, largely because of what's beneath it. These lions, which date back to Edward I, and the Stone of Scone. The Stone of Scone was carried away from Scotland by Edward I when he conquered that kingdom and was stuck underneath the coronation chair as a symbol of the conquest. And that's the chair on top of that stone that the king is anointed in. Now, there are a lot of Scots who don't particularly like that. And in 1950, four young students came down from, not from Inverness, but from Scotland, and they stole the stone, because even in 1950, it was just, the coronation chair was just sitting out in public in Westminster Abbey. They took the stone from under they actually broke it when they took it, but they stole the stone and they brought it up to Arbroath Abbey in Scotland, which was where a group of Scottish noblemen had declared Scottish independence in the 14th century. It was eventually found and was returned to its place underneath the coronation chair, but the current king and his advisors and the Houses of Parliament think it should be moved again. They think it should be returned to Perth in Scotland, where it will be moved in 2024. Will it be brought back down for further coronations? Well, the idea right now is yes, that it will be returned to the Abbey for further coronations. Stay tuned, I'm not sure. It may or it may not, depending on what the next king decides. Now we get to the investiture. This is when the king appears again. He's no longer seated on the coronation chair. He comes out and he sits in the crowning chair, and they give him all of the articles of the coronation, all of the stuff that symbolizes his office and his duties. Now, from the start of the coronation, the king is wearing a rather ornate, long robe, this super tunica gown. He wears that over a very plain white robe that's referred to as the shroud tunic, because it was the sort of white robe that people were buried in before the 19th century. And the shroud tunic is supposed to be a reminder of his humanity and his frailty, but nobody sees it except him. The super tunica that's over it is a very ornate garment. When he appears after the anointing, he's given a number of items. The spurs, which you see down here, which is a badge of his knighthood. The sword of offering, which I haven't shown here, and the gold bracelets known as armils that are put on his arms. And he then takes off the super tunica and puts on this robe, the robe royal. For a while this was called the robe imperial, but it's now considered that references to the empire should be removed from the coronation ceremony, so it's now called the robe royal. Once garbed, he takes up the orb, ring, and not one, but two scepters. Here's the orb, which is very, very ornate. Here's one of the two scepters. This is the sovereign scepter, and the diamond, as you see at the top, is the Cullinan diamond, the Star of Africa, which weighs 530.2 carats, for those who are interested. And he sits in his chair holding a scepter on either side of him, wearing this robe and his spurs, and oh yeah, he's got this hood that goes over his shoulders. He looks very magnificent. Now, I should point out, all of this stuff disappeared in the 1640s after the execution of King Charles I and the declaration of a republic in 1649. All of the investiture paraphernalia was sold off, boiled down, disposed of. And as a result, it all had to be replaced. Some of it was replaced by Charles II for his coronation, but they have kept replacing it ever since. The sovereign scepter only dates back about 100 years, the orb a little bit longer than that. The robes have been reworked since they were first fashioned in the early 19th century, I believe. So none of this is exactly what it was for earlier coronations. It resembles what was used at earlier coronations, with the exception of the scepters, which have become more and more ornate over time. And I don't think any monarch prior to well, it wouldn't have been Queen Victoria. She was the one who obtained the Cullinan diamond, but prior to Edward VII would ever have dreamed of having a diamond that size in their scepter. But indeed they do. The investiture is the first stage of the coronation, the actual coronation, the placing of the crown on the head of the monarch by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, this was meant to demonstrate that the crown was subject to the Church of England, and that the bishop, by placing the crown on the monarch's head, was demonstrating his actual precedence over the monarch. All right? For the last 200 years, that way of interpreting the ceremony has been, shall we say, contested. Contested not so much within the clergy, but by the monarch herself or himself. The first one really to object to it was Queen Victoria. She felt that bowing her head, or being shown to bow her head for the Archbishop of Canterbury, was demeaning. In fact, she did bow her head, but she did not wish to be represented in that way, and so this is how she was shown, with her head upright and the Archbishop looking down on her as if he's saying, "May I crown you, ma'am?" That's not how it happened. In fact, she was crowned by a particularly pompous Archbishop of Canterbury, and he made her bow her head before he would put the crown on it. And in fact, I watched Charles III quite carefully. He leant his head over a little bit when they placed the crown on it, but he didn't bow his head. He certainly, I wouldn't call that a bow. I would say it was a little inclination. And that is meaningful in the context of this ceremony. The enthroned monarch then receives the homage of the royal family, peerage, and bishops. Well, they used to receive the homage of the peerage, the bishops, and the royal family. They don't anymore. This next part of the ceremony was entirely eliminated at the coronation of Charles III on the grounds that it was outdated. His mother did it. His mother had the peers and the bishops up on stage pay homage to her, which means that in the case of the peers, they lift up their hats, their special coronation crowns. Every peer wears a little, it's a smaller crown than the monarch's crown, and it's not anywhere near as ornate, but every peer lifts up his crown and salutes the new, well, she's not new, but salutes the newly crowned monarch. And the bishops sort of incline their heads a little bit. That was considered outdated by Charles III. He eliminated it. What he really wanted to do was to have a homage paid by the whole crowd, but that was not really possible to negotiate, so they just skipped this whole part of the ceremony. I should note, in this painting of Queen Victoria's coronation, you'll notice her back is to the crowd. There's the crowd out there. And that's because in 1838, it was not considered important for the crowd to see what was happening on the stage. It became important in the 20th century. Probably the first coronation that really catered to the public in the same way as William IV's coronation had was the coronation of George V in 1911. And since then, it's become more and more of a public event. But Queen Victoria did not regard it in that way, and so she didn't mind that nobody could see what was going on. They weren't supposed to. And they would just have to wait until she would appear again for the exiting procession. And that's what follows the now abolished royal homage. The king stands up, processes to the door of the abbey, is met at the door of the abbey nowadays by a carriage that will carry him off. Now, they didn't always do that. Up until the 19th century, until Queen Victoria, in fact, they would go from Westminster Abbey to Westminster Hall, just across the street, and in Westminster Hall, they would have a big feast. They would eat an enormous dinner. That was what King George IV did in 1821. He followed his coronation with a grand banquet at Westminster Hall, which proved so expensive it was never repeated. His successor, William IV, had no banquet at all. Queen Victoria had no banquet at all. And from then onwards, no monarch has held a banquet at Westminster Hall. And you can kind of see from this depiction of it just why it was so costly. You can also see that the only people who got to eat were the peerage and the special guests of the king. The people sitting up in the balcony were just there to watch them, basically. So, to get back to my original question, what is the purpose of all this ceremony? It doesn't serve the purpose of making a king. It no longer serves the purpose of asserting the priority of the clergy over the crown, nor does it represent an acceptance of the crown by the nobility and the clergy as it did originally. The anointing still takes place, but in fact, it doesn't have that much meaning anymore because the king is not regarded to be the equivalent of a bishop. And it's unclear what the heck the purpose of the anointing actually is. Well, at the coronation of Edward IV in 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, considered that question. What is the purpose of a coronation? And he decided, not much. He stated in his sermon delivered at the coronation of Edward IV. I'm sorry, I've got that wrong. No, I haven't. I'm sorry. It's Edward IV. No, it isn't. It's Edward VI. Excuse me. It should be Edward VI in 1547. Archbishop Cranmer stated in his sermon that, quote, "The solemn rites of coronation have their ends and utility, yet neither direct force or necessity. They be good admonitions to put kings in mind of their duty to God, but no increasement of their dignity." In other words, Cranmer interpreted the coronation ceremony as meaning nothing more than that the king was dedicating himself to God. That was it. They did not lead to an increase in the dignity or the power of the monarchy, and they certainly weren't necessary. They were not carried out through direct force or necessity. That has not prevented a single monarch since 1547 from being crowned. They've all been crowned at the beginning of their reigns. So Cranmer's words had very little effect. They certainly had very little effect on the next monarch but one. He was the second next monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, who got herself crowned within 2 months of her accession, which is very fast. There was no Archbishop of Canterbury. All of her bishops had resigned their offices or been locked up in the Tower because they were all Roman Catholics. And so she was crowned by the one who was willing to do it, the Bishop of Carlisle. And this quickie coronation was carried out largely for reasons of legitimacy. And this leads me to what I think is the real reason for coronations. legitimacy. As I mentioned at the beginning, England did not have a succession law. In the absence of such a law, what monarchs could gain from the coronation was a public stamp of their own legal claim. A legal claim that was not backed up by any statutory law, that was based entirely on tradition. But after the coronation, in the minds of the monarch at least, could not be questioned. It didn't matter that this legitimacy came after the monarch's accession to the throne. It remained important, indeed fundamental, especially in cases of disputed legality. There has been no such case in Britain since 1714, let's say, George I, whose legality was disputed. However, every monarch since then has been crowned to put an end to the question. Once the coronation is over, all question of legality is set aside. Now, today, it doesn't seem as if it would be very necessary for the crown to resort to this means in order to establish their legality. And what is really backing up the coronation now is precedent. Every previous monarch has done it as a mark, very often as a mark of legality or of legitimacy, and so the present monarch has to do it as a mark of his own legitimacy. Whatever its alterations over the centuries, the coronation continues to confer legitimacy on the monarch. And when you look at him there, splendidly anointed, invested, and crowned, can any of us doubt that this fellow should be the king? Which, of course, leads to a further question: should there be a king at all? And that's a question I would be delighted to answer in the question and answer period. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions that you may have. Yes.
Responsible for putting all this together in the British system of government, or in the peerage, or
yeah, it's put together by a committee, and at the head of the committee are several leading members of the royal household. The committee has had a fluctuating membership in over many centuries, and most famously, Queen Elizabeth II put her husband, the Prince Philip, onto the committee, and he insisted it should be televised. But the committee consists of the Lord Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, I believe, and several other leading officers of the Crown. They follow the 1382 recension book, the Ordo, the Liber Regalis, but they allow changes in it, obviously, and they consult with the Crown, with the King or the Queen, in the course of putting together the ceremony. So the King or the Queen does have a definite input. They definitely have a say in it. And of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury is also a member of the coronation committee. It's often said today that they couldn't put a coronation together any faster than they do it. That was said of Charles III's coronation, because there's so much to plan out. In the early days, they could throw a coronation together very quickly, and nowadays you've got to work out the television rights. You've got to work out exactly what everybody's supposed to be doing at each particular moment, and no coronation has gone absolutely smoothly. The one that seemed to go the smoothest was Elizabeth II's. I think that's mainly because it was filmed on very grainy black and white film, and we couldn't see any mistakes. The one that went the most wrong was Queen Victoria's. There were a number of different mistakes. She didn't particularly care because it was just the coronation. As long as it was done, it was done. But there were a number of errors at Queen Victoria's. Yeah.
My hearing is not great, but you said after the coronation they walked back to Buckingham Palace, but they didn't own it. Did you say that?
I did mention that they didn't own Buckingham Palace until the late 18th century. It was built by the Duke of Buckinghamshire in around 1710, I think, and then his line died out, and his son or grandson was desperately trying to sell the place in the 1760s, and the Crown bought it, but it was a wreck when they bought it, and since then they have done it up, but it is still said to be unlivable, and I doubt very much that Charles III will spend any amount of time there. But I believe they bought it in 1767, but I'm not 100% sure that that's the correct date.
Question about the crown. As I understand it, when there was a kingdom of Hungary, the laws in that country were actually passed in the name of the crown, meaning
Yes.
the actual physical thing. Was that ever true of the English crown and the
No.
Scottish crown?
Well, in a broad way, they refer to the crown as meaning the monarch. But no, it wasn't. And the reason for that is because Hungary was initially an elective monarchy and remained an elective monarchy for a long time. So St. Stephen's crown represented the power of the nobility, if you want. And the holder of St. Stephen's crown was less important than the crown itself. So acts of the Hungarian Diet were passed in the name of St. Stephen's crown. That has never been the case in Britain. They are passed in the name of the monarch, who is always named in the act. And that has been true for as long as I know, so very early in the Middle Ages.
In the case of I think it was James, the young boy, did I get that name right? James, who was chosen as a king at 7, or whatever you say.
Oh, Henry the Sixth.
Sorry,
Henry the Sixth. Yeah.
And then it had no coronation until he was 14.
Yeah.
Who led during those years? Right?
His relatives, basically, and they continued to be the leading figures for a long time after he was crowned. Yeah, he was more or less a figurehead. Yeah. And the coronation didn't make any difference to that. He did later attempt to assert himself with disastrous effects, and England lost control of France. But Henry was more or less, he was dominated first by, I think, the Cardinal Beaufort, and later by his wife. So he was never really fully in charge.
Thank you. Well, let me ask you the question that you hinted at.
Yeah.
Where do you see this going in the future? The young people in Britain are not all that enthused about the monarchy, with all the social problems, and they see all this money being spent on the coronation.
Yeah.
But the late Queen was hugely popular, and this man has big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
He seems to be doing quite well so far.
Yeah.
So how do you feel it's going?
I think it's very early to judge. I don't think that any judgment on the monarchy can be an objective judgment, because there are too many sentiments tied up with the monarchy, and I think that has been particularly the case under Elizabeth II. She did leave very big shoes to be filled, but it's also true that for the first time at this coronation, you saw groups of people who were opposed to the monarchy appearing on the streets in not in huge numbers, but in force, and staging protests against the coronation. I don't think that's likely to increase, but if it did, I could certainly see the next monarch deciding, I'm not going to go through with it.
The police arrested a good number of them.
Yes, they did.
Just for showing up and complaining about it.
Yes, they did. They did, and I think quite unjustly. But where is that going to go? I don't know. I'm personally, I'm not a monarchist, but I don't want to give you an opinion based purely on my own sentiments. And I would say that the strength of the monarchy at the moment is quite formidable, and that Charles III has inherited that strength. Whether he will squander it or it will change for reasons that have nothing to do with him, I don't really know. It's asking for prediction, and historians are very, very reluctant to give predictions.
There is a very hard question as to what would happen if you got rid of the monarchy.
Yeah.
You replace it with people say, the really want president, Tony Blair, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
it's a
yeah.
failure for the country, at which point people tend to think that maybe they're still with what they're
Yes, well, that's right. Although I think probably they'd end up with President Fiona Bruce or someone, that they choose some genial newsreader who's not associated with either political party as their president. But it's all just purely speculative. And I will say that in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of dissatisfaction in Britain with the political system. And I think a good deal of, a surprising amount of that, to my mind, has rubbed off on the monarchy. And it comes mostly from younger people, but also from people who feel excluded by the political system or left out for whatever reason. And I think a lot of those people live in England. My perception is that many of them are in fact English. And this is a ceremony that's largely for the English. I'll be honest with you about that. I mean, the Scots like it, but it's not as important to them as the fact that they have a king. So in that case, I'm not sure which way things will go. If that sense of disillusionment with politics continues and gets worse, it could affect the monarchy. I'm not sure.
Let me declare myself as a monarchist.
Yeah.
I think a monarchy in this day and age is an anachronism. If it didn't exist, it couldn't possibly be invented.
Yeah.
But it does exist.
Yeah.
And I think it does, in the United Kingdom, serve a useful purpose. And I was always taught at school that it's not the power that the monarch has, it's the power that the monarch denies anyone else from getting.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, the loyalty of the police, the loyalty of the military, the loyalty of members of the Supreme Court is not to an elected political head. It's to somebody who has to remain very carefully non-political. And the Queen, and now the King, makes a very clear point of avoiding making political statements. And that, in fact, provides a value, an escape route to the political problems that beset the country. So as far as I'm concerned, as I say, I am brought up as a strong monarchist. I remain a monarchist. And I think it does serve a valuable purpose. But the king does have to be very careful that he has to modernize the monarchy. And you'll notice that the roles of the working royal family, that is to say, Prince William and his wife, and also the present Duke of Edinburgh and his wife, and the King and the Queen, and Princess Anne. They're the 7 members of the working royal family. And they very carefully keep away from the politics. But
And
one understands that there are, in this day and age, in the 21st century, differences of view.
Yeah, and I would only add to that Charles III, on occasion, has not been very good about keeping himself away from politics. It's known that in the 1990s he wrote a series of letters, referred to nowadays as the spider letters, to Tony Blair, trying to get him to do this or that. He may have learned his lesson there. I would hope so, and will stay away from politics as king. Time will tell. That's all I can say. But you've certainly presented a very good case for monarchy.
Who pays for all of that?
Well, you mean for all of this?
The whole pomp?
Well, in general, it's paid for by the British taxpayer. The single biggest part of the taxpayer's bill is police protection. So the policing of the coronation ceremony is the most expensive thing that goes directly on the bill of the taxpayer. The ceremony actually itself, interestingly enough, although it's so ornate and glittering, is not that expensive, because they already own this stuff, and the bishops don't take a cut, they don't take a payment in order to appear, and I believe they get their expenses paid, and the people up on stage generally are doing it for free. So the policing side of it is usually the most expensive part of these royal ceremonies, and over the years that has become a big bill. And for this coronation, it was a big bill. They're quite lucky that they no longer process on foot all the way from the Tower of London, because the policing expenditures for that would be mind-bending. But this was a fairly short procession. In fact, this whole coronation was done fairly cheaply relative to it was cheaper than the 1953 coronation in comparative terms, and I think probably cheaper than any previous coronation comparatively. So, and that was something Charles III wanted, and he brought it about.
Do you see future British coronations being affected at all by how coronations elsewhere in Europe have evolved or devolved?
Oh boy, no, but it's worth pointing out that this is really the last big coronation ceremony, and at one time it was one of the more modest coronation ceremonies, but now it's the biggest anywhere. And that's because most European countries no longer have monarchs. The ones that do either do not have a coronation ceremony, or the coronation ceremony is carried out privately, or if it's public, it's a very brief sort of a recognition ceremony. The really big coronations of the past there were three. There was the English coronation, the French coronation, and the coronation of a Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor's coronation was the biggest of the three. The coronation of the King of France got bigger and bigger over time until it really was so expensive and unmanageable. And the last of those was the coronation of Charles X in 1829. So the Holy Roman Empire is gone, the French monarchy is gone. This is the last coronation of any substance left in Europe. And I do not think that, that they're going to alter it fundamentally unless, as I said, the opposition to monarchy increases, in which case they might make it a much more abbreviated ceremony. But it was popular. It was it got a good audience around the world, and I think it has to be regarded as a success. So in that light, they will probably do it again.
On the stage, there was a woman who was very nicely dressed in modern clothing. It's a blue dress of some kind. Do you recognize her
Yeah,
as someone different than anybody else?
I'm trying to remember who she was. Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. And that was an innovation to have an ex-member of Parliament carrying the, or a member of Parliament, excuse me, carrying the sword. She paid for her own outfit. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I believe that they all did. That the Crown didn't cover any of the expenses of the outfits. Yeah, she was once considered as a possible leader of the Conservative Party, but never quite got there. Other questions?
Do you think England will win the World Cup?
That's not for me to say. It would be nice, though, wouldn't it? Yes. I mean, it would be nice. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.